Hey, greetings. Welcome to Categorical Imperatives. As always, I am your host, Lockie and Liberal. I want to thank you all so much for joining me here today. Now, if you are new to the show, I would especially like to welcome you. This is a podcast where we're going to be applying legal theory and moral philosophy to discussing current events in law, politics, and culture. Now, I've got something a little bit different for you guys today than what I would normally do. I think anyone paying any kind of attention to the bluster and the rhetoric that we have been hearing from the White House in this kind of grudge match with the Russian government fighting over the affections of the good people of Ukraine, you have likely noticed, as I did, that so much of what we are being told feels like there is big, important chunks of information absent from the reporting on it, at least in the corporate media. So I had an opportunity today to talk with Dave Decamp to try and get an understanding of what exactly is it that's being left out. Now, Dave is a writer and managing editor over at antiwar.com. He has been putting out some really stellar articles on this particular conflict over U.S. and Russia and Ukraine. So check out this video's description where you will find links. I'll put a number of his relevant articles right there in the links. They're definitely worth checking out. And if you're a regular listener of mine who for some reason still is not familiar with antiwar.com, you gotta go check those guys out. They have fantastic contributors, people such as Scott Horton, Kyle Anzalone, Sheldon Richman, and even some really interesting notable guys such as Pat Buchanan and Ray McGovern are all regular authors featured over there. So definitely go check them out. I will be putting a link to their site. It's easy. It's just antiwar.com. Anyways, so you will also find down in the video description links to where you can find my work as well, too, from the backup of the show that I do over on Odyssey to the audio version I put out on places like Spotify and Anchor. And you can go and read my other work at places such as Substack, the 10th Amendment Center, and the Libertarian Institute. And if you enjoy the show and you like the channel and you want to maybe either leave us a tip with PayPal or become a patron over on Patreon, you can find links to do all of that down in the description as well. And if you're not in a position to invest in the show in that way right now, that's all right. I still do really appreciate you coming by and spending some of your time here with me today all the same. And that goes for whether you are a first-time viewer or a long-time subscriber. Now, I just want to note, I had some issues during recording where my mic kind of got a little flaky a few times, so a few of the questions that I asked him don't come through terribly clear, but his answers all come through great. His mic sounded perfect, so I apologize for that little glitch. I tried to fix it, and you're getting the best I can do here. So, anyways, yeah, enjoy the interview with Dave. All right, we are recording. All right, hey everyone, welcome back to Categorical Imperatives. I am joined today by David Decamp. He is the managing editor over at antiwar.com, and I have him on to talk about the recent stuff going on with Russia and the United States over Ukraine. So David, thank you for giving me some time. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Bob.
Yeah, and before we kind of get started, do you want to just let people know, like a little bit, just introduce who you are, what you do, where people can find you online, stuff like that?
Yeah, so I work for antiwar.com. I'm the news editor. So I focus on the news stories that you see. If you go on the website, you'll see the news section is up top. I've been doing it full time for about a year and a half, but I started writing for them in like 2019, so it hasn't been that long. And so you could find all my work at antiwar.com. I'm on Twitter at Decamp Dave. I try to stay off there. I'm not super active on there, but I usually post articles and stuff. If people want to follow me there. But yeah, so for if anybody doesn't know, antiwar.com, it's a non-interventionist project. We're libertarians, the staff mostly, but we kind of publish stuff from all different political viewpoints. The main, it's like a single issue website, anti-war, non-intervention. So
Yeah.
that's what we do.
Yeah, really classic website too. I mean, they've been around forever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It still looks like it too. We got to
Yeah,
update the
yeah, it
page.
still kind of does actually, but that's all right.
Yeah.
The information's great. That's what's important.
Mm.
All right. Well, so the reason I wanted to have you on to talk about Russia is just when it comes to foreign policy kind of stuff. Like, it's really hard to get any kind of accurate information. Like, it feels to me almost like if all you were watching was mainstream media, you would get the idea that just recently, out of nowhere, Russia just started amassing hundreds of thousands of troops on Ukraine's border for no reason, with no provocation whatsoever. And so, which I doubt is even true that they were amassing troops, but that whatever is going on happened without provocation. So can you kind of
Mm.
where does this go back to? I mean, how far does this uh sort of current issue go back?
Well, I mean, you could say it goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decision not to make Ukraine part of Russia. But for to keep it more narrow, the latest crisis, it really goes back to 2014, which is when the United States backed a coup in Ukraine to overthrow Viktor Yanukovych because he was more pro-Russia than the U.S. wanted, and then some political elements inside Ukraine wanted. And there's no disputing the fact that the U.S. was involved in the coup. The most infamous thing, there was a leaked phone call and it was Victoria Nuland, who's in Biden's State Department now, but at the time she was like an assistant secretary of state under Obama for like Europe. I forget what her title was, but some kind of assistant secretary of state. And she was talking with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, and they were basically deciding who was going to take over the government once it was overthrown. And then, a few days or weeks later, there was an overthrow, and these people ended up in charge. So that was obviously, if you're Russia, that's a pretty major provocation. That's as if Russia, it's like a cliche point to make, like what if Russia was doing it to us, but it's an important point. Like what if Russia overthrew the government of Mexico, or helped overthrow the government of Mexico? I mean, that would be so major. So this happened, and this is what sparked Russia to come in and annex Crimea. And it's also important. This is very. It's just these are important points that this is what kind of sparked all this. They say Russia invaded Ukraine and took Crimea for no reason, but it was sparked by the coup. There was a referendum. People vote. You could dispute how accurate it is. I think they said like 96% of people in Crimea voted to join Russia. Maybe you could dispute that, but at the end of the day, they took Crimea without firing a shot. So I think that says that the people of Crimea were happy to join Russia. And it's a historical thing. I mean, Russia had a naval base in Crimea, since like the 1700s, and
Yeah.
and throughout the 90s and 2000s, they were renting it from Ukraine. It's a strategic spot for Russia. And then also that coup also sparked the separatists in the eastern Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk. They're
The
self-declared
Chechen rebels
republics.
or whatever.
They're not Chechen, but they're in eastern Ukraine.
Okay.
They're Russian speaking. I think ethnicity wise, it's kind of half Russian, half Ukrainian out there, but they're mostly Russian speaking. And they rejected this post coup government. And they actually asked Russia if they could join, if they could be annexed and join Russia, and Putin
Oh,
said no.
really?
That's a yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So these are big details, because if Putin wanted that area of Ukraine, he probably would have just taken it then, because he already took Crimea.
Right.
So you get in, and um, you get into this now with everything, like you said. If you don't follow this, I mean, when I get in my car and just turn it on before like I hook up my Bluetooth, I think it's NPR comes on.
Yeah.
And like just this morning, I heard they're like, "Oh, Russia's still massing troops at the border, and
Oh,
probably going to invade Ukraine. And there's this Russian fueled war that's been going on in eastern Ukraine, you know." And if you don't know any better, then it sounds like, yeah, they're preparing. They're like, Russian troops are lined up at the border, like looking into Ukraine,
right.
but really, um, and but what seems to be happening is Russia has bases in the region, and it does seem like there's more troops there than there were, but they're not right near the border. Some are over 100 miles away. One in the north that is closer to Belarus, and then the base in Crimea is the base on the, you know, on the Black Sea. It's not uh, closer to Ukraine. It's closer to the Black Sea than Ukraine.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is because the U.S. and NATO, since 2014, but especially in like the past year, have really increased their activity in the Black Sea. I mean, if you look at the Black Sea, it's like a landlocked, huge sea. The only way in is through the, I think it's the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have that name right, but that's the only way in. You know, it's basically like a huge lake, and the U.S. and NATO are just, there's always warships in there. They're flying spy planes and bombers near Russia. So, you know, this is all left out of the mainstream narrative.
Right. Yeah. It seems like a great example of, yeah, I think what Scott often refers to as like a truncated view of history, where you just kind of start wherever it's convenient for you to start.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and you know, Scott,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Scott has, you know, his knowledge of history is way more extensive than mine, so I'm sure he would be able to tell you more about, you know, how far back this really goes. But in modern
Yeah.
history, it's really 2014 is like the pivotal year.
Yeah. Well, his knowledge of just about everything is more than other people's, I found. So it's amazing.
Yeah,
Whatever you talk to him about, he already knows everything about it. It's insane. But
yeah,
um, so I guess then, if we like you're talking about, if we have NATO and the U.S. in the Black Sea, I mean, isn't that a provocation on our part? Really? Was that unfair to say?
yeah. I don't think so. I mean, that's how I look at it, and that's how Moscow looks at it. And so right now, you know, kind of the good news is that there's been a lot of talks between the U.S. and NATO and Russia, and they're kind of continuing. They held talks last week. Russia, they presented like a series of security proposals to the U.S., and they're like kind of key demands where they want to promise that Ukraine won't join NATO like ever, and then they want to work out agreements on the deployment of like their militaries near each other's borders, because like I said, there's always these spy planes and sometimes bombers flying near Russia. And Latvia and Estonia, two countries that border Russia, they're both NATO members, and there's major U.S. led drills there each year, a few times a year usually. Um, so yeah, and then, you know, the U.S., the establishment view is that, oh, it's not a provocation. We're helping. You know, all these European countries are scared that Russia's going to invade, so we have to be over there helping them. But I think it's just nonsense. And what's happening with Ukraine, I mean, I really don't see Russia has not like nothing to benefit from invading Ukraine, from
Right.
like trying to topple the government. I mean, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and it seems like people always assume that Vladimir Putin is like an irrational actor, which is the complete opposite. I mean, this is a cold, calculating guy. I mean,
Mm.
he, the way when we watch the news, I mean, you get the feeling that he's liable to do anything at any point for any reason, and that seems to go against everything that we've known about him since he kind of came to prominence.
Yeah, yeah, he's very smart, politician. Whatever you think about him, there's no
Right.
denying that. So the response, so like I said, kind of the major Russian demand, because Ukraine is what they call like a prospective NATO member. I think in 2008 they promised them that eventual membership. And then when Yanukovych was in from 2010 to 2014, that was never like kind of a thought that Ukraine would join NATO. But now, since they overthrew his government and taking Crimea, I guess that took away a major kind of more pro-Russia voting bloc. So
Yeah.
Ukraine, as a whole country, they probably just vote more pro West, I guess you could say, or EU. But
Right.
um, so yeah, and so Ukraine joining NATO, that's always been a red line for Putin. And the U.S. and NATO publicly kind of rejected that demand, but they're still talking. I mean, Blinken, Secretary of State, he's meeting with Russia's foreign minister Friday again in Geneva. So they've both said they're open to talking about missile deployments and more arms control stuff. So hopefully the talks continue. I think that's kind of the only good sign here.
Well, yeah, hopefully, but it seems like you said, the one real big red line is Ukraine not coming into NATO. It seems like we're really not bending on that one at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I should mention this. In December, because this is all the public stuff, in December there's an Associated Press report that I think they cited a State Department official or an anonymous Biden administration official that said the Biden administration made clear to Ukraine that they're not going to be joining NATO for at least a decade, which basically means that you know you're not joining NATO anytime soon. I mean, anything that
Right.
happens in a decade, things can change so much by then. So that is kind of maybe some sort of compromise can be made there with Russia. Like they'll guarantee it for a certain amount of years, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Russia seems like they're not settling for anything less than that. But it's like this is all the public, what we're hearing, the bluster. Hopefully, there's some deals being made behind the scenes.
Right. Well, and speaking of bluster, I guess one thing I wanted to ask you about too is I actually saw you just had a more recent article that I think the title was "White House claims Russia could attack Ukraine at any point." And
Mm-hmm.
is there any reason to believe that other than the White House's say so? It just I mean, it just seems like they're completely throwing that out there for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing this since like November. They've been saying that Russia's plotting an invasion, but in the past few weeks, it's become more and more like making it sound more imminent. Uh, but I mean, I don't see any reason to believe it. In eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, there is a war zone there, and it's been a stalemate for the most part since 2015. But there's flare-ups occasionally. So I think the thing you have to worry about is something flaring up there, and then they'll blame it all on Russia, and then that can be like their proof that, oh, you see, we knew that Russia was going to invade.
Right.
In Russia, I'm not sure to what extent Russia's support for the separatists there goes. I think there might be maybe some deniable special forces, but then again, there's also the U.S. and they have like deniable special forces in Ukraine, so they can't really give Russia a tough time for that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they give them some support through weapons and stuff, but it's not exactly a Russia fueled war at all. Like that NPR segment made it seem like that I heard this morning. So, um, and the U.S. they're accusing. This was last week. They said that Russia is plotting a false flag in eastern
What?
Ukraine. That they were gonna, yeah, yeah. This was just last week.
Oh man.
So they said Russia was plotting a false flag against the separatists in eastern Ukraine. So they were gonna, and they said Russia was gonna stage an attack on the separatists and then use that as a pretext for an invasion. So there you go. They kind of set it up. So if there is a flare up, if Ukraine attacks the separatists, they're going to say, "Oh, it was Russia's false flag,"
Right.
which is just
Yeah.
such nonsense.
Yeah.
And there was also the false flag like claim was kind of overshadowed by, uh, or it overshadowed another report. This was from Yahoo News that said the CIA. It revealed that the CIA has been training Ukrainian paramilitaries in the United States since 2015. And this was another. It was like they cited anonymous officials, but it's a pretty believable report. And one of the sources said that the program was training Ukrainians how to kill Russians. That was a quote from a former CIA official. So, I mean,
Wow.
imagine that the other way around, that Russia is training Mexicans to kill Americans or something. Like
Right.
it is, you really have to consider their
Yeah.
viewpoint.
It almost it seems more worrying that the news coming out of the White House, it sounds almost more like we got another neoconservative in office. I mean, just making anything up he needs to get to where he wants to go.
Yeah.
Like that almost seems more threatening or more troublesome than actually what's actually happening over there.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's kind of like a lot of factions in the Biden administration,
Yeah.
and there's one that's more hawkish with Ukraine, and they're kind of controlling the narrative by planting these stories in the media. And because the false flag claim, it started as a CNN report. An anonymous random official told Natasha Bertrand, who's a CNN reporter, who's basically a discredited journalist because she like built her career on the Steele dossier. If the that
Yeah.
fake opposition research document that had like the P tape, Trump's the all the dirt on Trump and Russia, that
Yeah.
everybody knows now is just nonsense, and that's
Yeah.
how she started her career and like got boosted and got her job at Politico and now CNN.
Well,
So there's no reason to believe it. And then
yeah,
it jumped around to like every major media outlet, and then the White House started saying it too. And they never
right.
said that they had any evidence for it. Like they just said
Yeah.
we have information. It's crazy.
Yeah, although I mean, like you'll still hear people. I mean, even today, talking about the Steele dossier and the Russian collusion. Like, it's amazing that there's still people who seem to be clinging on to that too. So I don't know.
Yeah, and you got to
Yeah,
think how much of that is kind of fueling the propaganda we're seeing, the anti-Russia stuff that you see on TV, because people are ready to swallow it because for 4 years, 5 years, they were screaming that Russia stole the election.
right. Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
So, I want there's something else I wanted to ask you about here too before we go. It kind of shifts gears a little bit, but I don't know if you've seen this, but there's sort of this big thing going on where Putin put out a statement recently where he was talking about how the problem with empires, and he essentially compared the Soviet Union to the United States. Have you seen that at all?
No, I haven't actually. That sounds
Oh,
interesting though.
yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, he was talking about how the problem with empires is that they uh, start making a lot of small mistakes, and there's little corruption, and there's little lies, and things like that, and it builds up and up, and essentially that it's all those little things building up that leads to uh, really the collapse of an empire. And so I was kind of curious what you thought about, because that's really controversial. A lot of people are really getting upset about that. Like, it's not true, but I was kind of curious
Hmm.
about what you think there. I mean, I know it sounds like you haven't heard it yet, but
Yeah, no, I haven't. But I mean, if what he's saying, like, I mean, if you look at the U.S. empire right now, it's not looking very good, especially after Afghanistan.
right,
Um, any schmuck with the internet connection could have told you that the Afghanistan withdrawal would have been happened that way because of how the U.S. backed Afghan government was just completely. It would just have never on its own. This was very obvious to anybody who had half a brain. And there's even an inspector general, a U.S. government, that was saying this the whole time too. And it happened, and everybody was shocked by it. But it's because it was money making scheme for the weapons makers, and
Yeah.
then that's really all it was. And the U.S. wants some control in Central Asia, which and it didn't want to give up those bases there. But just watching that, like how quickly and how just what a mess it was optically. It was so bad for the uh, you know perception of the empire.
Right.
And I mean, at some point, another like it does kind of seem like a flailing empire in decline in the U.S. right now. Um,
Yeah.
One thing I think that's really telling is how quick the U.S. is to sanction countries. There used to just be a few countries like Cuba under like a ton of U.S. sanctions, but now there's a lot. I mean, it's Cuba, North Korea, obviously they've been for a while, but now also Venezuela, Iran again. Um, there's a chance Nicaragua could end up like that, and then you have China and Russia, and they see this, and they're kind of working to create kind of an alternate global financial and trade market
Yeah.
that's not dominated by the U.S. And I think that how quick that will build up will could play a big role in the collapse of the U.S. empire. But also, these things would take like a really long time, especially with China. They're like the new boogeyman for the U.S., but they're also our top trading partners. So it would take
Right.
decades to really economically decouple from China. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, there's a lot of factors.
I'm curious. When you talk about the sanctions, what exactly is the relationship between our sort of desire to sanction, or what does it say about us that we're turning to sanctions more quickly and that we're using that almost as more like a first line of defense, as opposed to other, I suppose, I don't know, more diplomatic methods or whatever you might want to say.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just kind of like this bully mentality that the U.S. has. Like, if a government doesn't fall in line, they're just immediately like they just go to the sanctions. They're like, okay, we'll just destroy your economy.
Okay,
Like
yeah,
it's really it's just power. It's just about power and control. Like they don't want anybody going against them. But I think it is revealing that uh, it's kind of like a flailing move. I think these sanctions and stuff.
yeah. And since you mentioned China just a moment ago, there was something else I wanted to ask about. So I'm actually kind of looking to an article of yours here from not too long ago, talking about how U.S. is unhappy with Russia-China ties,
Mm.
and you say something that the political report said the most striking and of greatest concern of the U.S. is Russia and China's increased military and technological cooperation. The U.S. concern over advancements in technology is reflected by the Pentagon's $715 billion budget request for the 2022 fiscal year, $112 billion for the research of advanced weapons technology. I mean, is that really necessary? I mean, don't we already spend far more than Russia and China combined on our military?
Yeah, that's a good point. And what's really kind of sickening is that I think that was before Congress passed their version of the Pentagon spending bill, of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, the one that Biden just signed. He asked for 753 billion, and Congress gave him an extra 25 billion. They gave him 778 billion, and they increased that. I think the budget for the research and development, that's like hypersonic, AI, robotics, all this kind of scary stuff.
Yeah.
So they increased that. And it really is a bipartisan push. I mean, $778 billion in 1 year. Because you think now, like some of these crazy spending bills they're passing, like $2 trillion relief
Right.
bills and stuff, you know, a lot of them are over a certain amount of years, but the military is still just this massive budget. And then if you add budget for the intelligence agencies and stuff, you get to $1 trillion quick for the annual, the cost of the empire. And that's a big thing now is, you'll see a lot of stuff in the news about China's weapons tests, Russia's weapons tests. I mean, they're really want to bring us into this new arms race just so people in Washington can make money. Sometimes I think it is just as simple as that, because there is just so much money to be made for these people. But yeah, and people just have to be cautious. A lot of times you'll see something like Russia tested an anti-satellite missile, which sounds scary. And I think space weapons, I hope that there's not this big arms race in space that just bums me out. But the U.S. tested a missile like that like years before Russia ever did. So they act like it's that what Russia and China is doing is so crazy when the U.S. has been doing the same thing the whole time.
Right. All right. Well, just to kind of, I suppose, wrap up here, is there anything else about the thing with China, or not, excuse me, China, the U.S. and Russia, and what's going on right now? Maybe I didn't ask about, or any point that you feel is important to make that I maybe haven't touched on yet that people who aren't familiar with this story should pay attention to or be aware of, or anything like that?
I would just, with Russia and the U.S., I mean, everything, I've just been focusing on this Ukraine stuff so much. There could be some other things going on that missing, but I think the big thing to look out for, I mean, they just announced today, the U.S., that they're giving Ukraine an extra $200 million in military aid, and I think that's on top of the $300 million they're getting this year.
Yeah.
So that means they're getting close to like $3 billion in aid that they've just given to Ukraine since the coup in 2014.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah. So, and the more that you see, the more that signals that the U.S. isn't going to really change tact here, and the tensions could keep escalating. But like I said, it's good that dialogue is happening, and there's a big difference between what we're seeing publicly from both sides, from Russia and the U.S., what they're saying and what they're discussing behind the scenes.
Right.
But yeah, I think just keep in mind, if you read anything about Russia right now, just don't believe it on your instinct. If it's foreign policy related, you could probably read about it at antiwar.com if it's related to this stuff. But in general, that's a big part of the propaganda, is kind of demonizing, making these countries look bad. You'll see the New York Times report about, I don't know. I remember when Russia really became like the bad guy back towards the end of the Obama administration. Yeah. There's all this stuff about how Russia treats gay people. Like you always see, and with China now too. I mean, China, it's just all about China. But, and it's not like this stuff isn't happening, but it's being exaggerated by the Western media to make them look bad, to get the people like primed to accept that they're like our enemy, and that, we might go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Somehow that's even a realistic option. Or we might go to war with China over Taiwan. Another insane thing to think of, because they both have nukes. We just can't go to war with them, and neither Ukraine nor Taiwan are worth ending the world over. I think that's pretty rational view,
or anything like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that will do it then. So yeah, definitely, people, if you want more information on this, antiwar.com is definitely the place to go. I will have links to the website. I'll have links to Dave's Twitter, and I referenced a number of articles here. I'll make sure to have links to all of those down in the description. So go check Dave out and check those articles out when you have a chance. And so, Dave, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yep. All right.
Motherfucker, like Freddie Mercury. Motherfucker. trunk full of M's, brother.